All right, hello and welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics. My name is Charlie Johnson, and I'm a member of the Dole Institute's Student Advisory Board, the official student group of the Institute. The Student Advisory Board is a bipartisan group whose members can access many great opportunities through their involvement with the Institute, including volunteering at programs and networking with our special guests. If you are a student and would like to join, please contact us by emailing dolesab@ku.edu or speaking with a student worker after the program. A video of today's program will be available on our YouTube channel soon, and you can also access videos of past programs by visiting our YouTube channel at any time. A loop hearing system is available to use if you have a T-coil or hearing aid. We also have a limited number of listening devices. If you have questions about the loop system, or if at any time during the program you have difficulty hearing, please alert one of our staff members or student volunteers. After the program, we will have some time for the audience to ask questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand and a student worker with a microphone will come to you. Please stand if you are able and ask just one brief question. The Dole Institute's mission is to foster civil and respectful discussion around important and often difficult topics. Please phrase your questions with this in mind. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you to please turn off your cell phones. And now, please join me in welcoming Senior Associate Director, Dr. Barbara Ballard.
Thank you very much, Charlie. You know, I always say it's a treat for us to have our students give you a welcome, and you did a fine job. I will say good evening and welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics for our very first in-person evening program in 18 months. And I think you all know we were not doing it because of the pandemic. We are extremely happy to have you with us this evening, so thank you so very much for coming. Tonight's interview will be conducted by the Dole Institute Director, Bill Lacey, and is co-sponsored by KU's Center for Sexuality and Gender Diversity. I also hope you'll join us next Thursday, September the 16th, at 7 p.m. for our annual Constitution Day program, and the title is The Constitution and COVID-19. We are honored to welcome renowned political journalist Sasha Issenberg back to the Institute for his fourth visit with us. Sasha teaches in the political science department at UCLA and is the author of 4 books on topics ranging from the global sushi business to medical tourism and the science of political campaigns. Tonight, he joins us to discuss his latest book that came out in June, and it's called The Engagement, America's Quarter-Century Struggle Over Same-Sex Marriage. Following the conversation, we'll host a book sale and signing so you can secure your own copy of The Engagement. And now, let me ask you, please give Sasha a very warm Jayhawk welcome.
Working either, is it? Can you hear me? Oh, okay. Now, there we go, a little bit of volume. Sasha, I want to welcome you back to the Institute. I think we figured out this is your 4th trip here, and you did some research for the book here. So let's start with a question that I like to ask every guest here. Tell us a little bit about your upbringing and your education.
Sure. Thank you all for having me and doing this in person. It's really nice to be in the same room as people you're talking to. I grew up in New York. I went to high school in New York, went to college at Swarthmore College in Pennsylvania, where I studied history. And I sort of knew probably from the age of about 15 that I wanted to be a journalist. I had become very interested in politics as a kid. The part of my brain that started at like age 5 or 6 was obsessive about baseball, turned somewhere around the age of 11 to be like obsessive about politics, and you know, whatever monomania led me to remember like batting averages turned into like, you know, being able to name members of Congress and knowing who was running for Senate and stuff like that. And so I went through a few years in, you know, I guess what we now call my tweens, like volunteering on campaigns, I went door to door for Bill Clinton as a 12-year-old. I also volunteered for a family court judge that year. I can only imagine like what the people on the other end of the phone bank calls were thinking when some prepubescent 12-year-old called asking them to vote for a family court judge in Nancy Cooney. And I got lucky enough to intern in a magazine when I was 15, and I realized that my interest in politics remained, but I was far more drawn to being an observer than being a participant. And so everything I've done since then has been in journalism in some form, but I've done a whole lot of things under that umbrella. So I've been a newspaper reporter, a magazine writer and editor. I've written a whole bunch of books. I've freelanced for things in all different formats, and now I do a little bit of teaching too.
Okay. I'm impressed by your conversion from baseball to politics. My background is shockingly similar, so we'll have to talk about that sometime. What made you want to write a book about the history of same-sex marriage?
So the idea first came to me 10 years ago in 2011. So I was working on this book that I guess Barbara mentioned, The Victory Lab, which was the first time I came to speak here in, I believe, the fall of 2012, as best we could reconstruct. It was about the science of political campaigns. And so I was having a lot of conversations over the course of researching that book with pollsters or people who measured political opinion in some form or another. And over again, folks would make a version of the same observation to me, which is that they never seen attitudes on the single issue move as quickly as they were moving at that time on same-sex marriage. And nobody had a really good fingertip explanation for this. And that just struck me as a puzzle, because I'd been writing enough about campaigns. I understood how difficult persuasion was and sustained persuasion. And this seemed like specifically the type of issue on which opinions would be really slow to move. Our ideas about marriage are grounded in often religion, tradition. This wasn't, do you think we should have 2,000 residual troops in Afghanistan, or should the infrastructure bill be $1 trillion or $2 trillion or something where maybe you read an op-ed and it's persuasive in one direction or the other? The idea was, we thought that people brought these really deep, unmoving ideas about what constituted a family to this debate. And so that was just this really interesting puzzle to me. And at the same time, we were starting, though, to talk about this as the sort of defining civil rights movement of my lifetime. And I came to realize I did not have any idea sort of where it had come from as an issue, how it had become the kind of defining sexual politics fight for my generation. I realized I'd been alive through the whole life of this as a political issue. I'd covered politics through most of it, and I just had no idea how. I'd been Bill probably has a version of this experience. I'd been at the Republican convention covering it in 2004, where everybody assumed that this issue cut only one way politically across the country. And in 2012, I was at the Democratic convention, where a president who was on the other side of the issue, everybody thought that it cut an entirely different way. And I wanted to write a book that sort of covered the whole arc of how we got from over there was to wherever we were at the time.
How did this issue initially come up in the U.S.?
So the important thing to realize is this was not in any meaningful way an issue until the mid-90s. And there had been a handful of fitful lawsuits in the years after Stonewall by gays and lesbians who were sort of testing the limits of sort of gay liberation, and a bunch that went into court, sued for marriage rights, and didn't really go anywhere. My story starts in around 1990 in Hawaii, where the main character is this guy named Bill Woods, who was basically the gay rights activist in Hawaii in the 1970s and 80s. And I think, like a lot of sort of first-generation activists in any sphere, he was incredibly entrepreneurial. He started the first gay newspaper, the Gay Community Center, the Gay Men's Discussion Group. Very good at sort of getting attention for his projects. Not terribly good at working in in partnership or coalition with other people. And he ends up on a pride planning committee, so we're in 1989 now, to plan the gay pride festivities in Honolulu in June 1989. And he wants to have a parade, and he's up against two women, two lesbian women who sort of run this pride planning committee who do not want to have a parade. Honolulu had a parade once in 1974. It's very difficult to put on a parade. It's not a terribly large community. They had a picnic and a vigil and a whole bunch of other things, but they did not want to have a parade. And they also really resented Bill Woods, and he resented them, especially because they had just launched a magazine, a monthly glossy magazine that now competed with his Gay Community News for what you can imagine is the very large pool of advertisers who want to be in LGBT publications in Honolulu in 1989. So they don't want his parade, and they tell him, you can have a subcommittee to explore the feasibility of putting on a parade. If any of you have done, like, I apologize for whatever PTSD from event planning committee fights you've had for anything on this. So he gets a subcommittee, and he goes out and starts calling around basically to mainland organizations that have put on parades. It comes up with a report on how you put on a parade, and he brings the report, and they still don't want anything to do with this parade. So he decides he's going to start his own committee, the Pride Parade and Rally Council, that's now going to compete with the established gay pride organizers in Honolulu. So he's looking for everything he can do to have his parade upstage their picnic. So he invites the Royal Hawaiian Jazz Band. He asks the governor to be the grand marshal. A friend of his who's a caterer agrees to hold an international food festival. And he decides at the end of this parade, there's going to be a rally stage with like speeches, and there's going to be a sort of Mooney-style mass wedding on stage, and this is going to be the kind of major spectacle at the end of his thing. And there had been couples who'd been exchanging vows at the Metropolitan Community Church, which is a sort of denominationally ambiguous, gay-friendly church, and they'd been doing these holy union ceremonies where couples exchange vows fully aware that there was no legal force behind them. And Bill Woods was not a lawyer. He clearly misread the state's family law code, and he came away with the misguided impression that if these couples exchange vows on stage, that the state might actually have to recognize them. And so he went to the state affiliate of the ACLU and asked them, hey, I think that these couples can marry. If this becomes a legal thing, will you back me up? And they did not want to be part of this, I think, for a couple of reasons. One, they actually had real lawyers who read the state's family law code and thought that, this was a rather poor reading of it, and the courts were likely not going to agree. And also they recognized, though, that, nobody basically wanted to go into business with Bill Woods on something because you realize that he would sort of take over and it would become his spectacle, and they did not want to be part of that. But they also did not want to say no to him because they know that if you pick a fight with Bill Woods, he'll get a bunch of attention for it. So basically throughout 1990, what's happening is that the state ACLU is trying to delay him and put him off with the idea that June 1990 will come around, he'll have his parade or whatever, the wedding won't happen because he won't have a, whatever legal basis he needs for it, and then he'll move on to his next thing. And so, they say they need to check with the main office in New York, and they need legal opinions from scholars on the mainland, all this stuff. And June comes and goes, the Pride festivities happen, and Bill Woods doesn't have his wedding, but now he's really pissed off that the ACLU is disrespecting him. And so December 17th, 1990, he decides he's going to force the ACLU's hand by bringing these three couples into the state public health department to request marriage licenses. Puts out a press release. He basically gets the entirety of the Honolulu press corps to show up. These couples request marriage licenses. They're rejected. The Attorney General later says that the health director was correct not to award these licenses. And he leads the couples to the ACLU office. And Woods' thinking is, okay, well, the ACLU could say no to me in private or, delay me in private, but basically I'll jam them if there are real couples in front of them and press coverage. This organization that says that it cares about the rights of gays and lesbians can't possibly say no to them then. And guess what? The ACLU still says no to him. And so the next month, these three couples end up in the hands of a local civil rights attorney in Honolulu who files what he totally acknowledges as a long-shot lawsuit challenging the state's marriage statute. And in May 1993, to the surprise of everybody involved, including the lawyer who filed that suit, the Hawaii Supreme Court becomes the first court anywhere on earth to recognize that the fundamental right to marriage can extend to same-sex couples. And that is the moment that this becomes, I think, what we would call an issue. It becomes like a viable legal objective for couples in other states to consider, and it becomes a political issue that, before this Hawaii case started, there's barely a single politician in the country who had been asked for his or her opinion about gay marriage. There wasn't a gay rights organization in the United States that had defined this, that had endorsed marriage as an objective. And all of a sudden, by the mid-90s, this is a thing that is not abstract anymore.
Okay. The Republican Party, which sold itself in the 60s and 70s as the party of ultimate individual liberty, how did the Republican Party wind up on the anti-side of this issue?
Yeah, so what happens in response to the Hawaii case, that the first institution on the mainland to really understand the importance of what the Hawaii Supreme Court did was the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And Mormons had a sort of historic presence in Hawaii dating back to missionary work in the Pacific 100 years earlier. And they're large landowners, they're politically very well connected there. And the LDS Church basically comes up with a three-pronged response to this. One, help put a piece of legislation in front of the Utah legislature, which passes it, becomes a template for other state legislatures around the country that says, just to be clear, Utah is not going to recognize gay couples even if another state marries them. Two says, we're going to go in and try to get the Hawaii state legislature to pass a bill or possibly amend the Constitution to take this out of the court's hands. And they was effectively a front group in Honolulu, working in tandem with the local archdiocese with the understanding that the Mormons will deliver the money and most of the manpower and strategy, but that local Catholic leadership is a sort of better public face for this movement. And then they decide we're going to try to get other mainland, we're going to raise awareness with other religious groups on the mainland, and that becomes not just Catholics, but evangelical fundamentalist Christians as well. And so it's certainly what we would call at the time the religious right, religious conservatives, who are making this a national issue. And what is, and that leads to the Defense of Marriage Act in 1996. Which is the effort by Congress to basically insulate other governments, the 49 other states and the federal government, from having to recognize same-sex couples that they expect will be basically married any day now in Hawaii. And at that point, basically the entire Republican Party is arrayed against gay marriage and in favor of the Defense of Marriage Act. But at that point, so are basically every Democrat, almost every Democrat of any prominence says that they're opposed to same-sex marriage. Ted Kennedy's really the only significant exception in 1996. And when the Defense of Marriage Act comes up in the House and Senate, a majority of Democrats are voting against it, and Bill Clinton signs it into law. So certainly there's more unanimity among Republicans, but basically the entire political establishment wanted nothing to do with this issue anywhere.
Okay. How did the nationalization of the issue affect the politics of same-sex marriage?
So, there's no reason this had to be a sort of federal issue or a national issue. Under our constitutional system, our system of laws, states have incredible leeway to define family structure and marriage. It's only exceptional circumstances in which the federal government has stepped in to basically set boundaries on what states can do in terms of defining or recognizing marriages. In the late 19th century, the sort of polygamy crisis led the led Congress to basically set as a standard for admission into the Union that territories couldn't allow polygamy. There was some effort to standardize divorce laws in the early 20th century. Obviously, the Supreme Court in 1967 ruled that state bans on interracial marriages were unconstitutional. But these are really unusual circumstances. And so, you know, the one thing that from the perspective of a Republican Party, not just that, you know, as you say, Bill, cared about, you know, individual freedom or personal liberty, but also that respected states' rights and had a sort of federalist view was the unusual circumstance of basically saying with the Defense of Marriage Act that the federal government will come in and write into federal laws a, you know, what Anthony Kennedy in the Supreme Court opinion said was a, you know, gesture of disrespect towards a group of people whose own states had, through their own political or legal processes, allowed them to marry. What that did was it made this an issue that nobody could run from. It was probably more of a problem politically for Democrats in the 90s. You know, if there hadn't been the Defense of Marriage Act, it would have been very easy, I think, for a lot longer for Democrats and maybe even moderate Republicans to say, this is something that's going on in Hawaii's courts. I represent Kansas, or I represent Delaware, whatever. I don't weigh in on Hawaii constitutional questions. All of a sudden, this is something that's before the House and Senate that the president is signing, and it made this a national issue, not just a sort of local culture, you know, sideshow.
What was the effect of activism in terms of changing the way that government officials approached and felt about this issue?
Yeah, I mean, so you know, I think one of it, to some degree, you know, I think we need maybe an expanded understanding of activism here. So I think that one thing that's clear throughout the whole arc of the marriage fight is this is a place where politicians followed the public. There are very few instances of politicians, you know, being leaders in public opinion as you see them move. You know, basically what happened, the shorthand of what happened in public opinion is 1996, when pollsters first start, 95, 96, when pollsters first start asking about this question, 27% of Americans support same-sex marriage rights. This summer, Gallup found 70% of Americans support same-sex marriage rights, including for the first time a majority of Republicans. And that movement has just been across demographic, generational groups through that time. And politicians, Democrats and Republicans, have almost always been laggards have made the shift on the issue only when it's been really clear that whatever a majority of whatever constituency they represent or care about supports marriage rights. One thing that's, when you think back in this history, and I think about it often in comparison to the civil rights movement, the movement for racial equality, which is the sort of natural analog for something like this, is how little mass activism there was. If you can think of a major large-scale protest for marriage equality, I'd love to hear about it. If you ever saw anybody get arrested for an act of civil disobedience related to marriage equality, I'd love to hear about it. There are some stray examples on the margins, but there was not a kind of like Selma or, you know, Montgomery bus boycott sort of, you know, civil disobedience type, you know, what we sort of assume as mass action activism. What there were, you know, was, I think, a lot of activity that was driven by courts through litigation, in the case of Hawaii, sort of accidental litigation, and then some very purposeful sort of traditional civil rights litigation, and a use, you know, that was supported by activist groups that became increasingly savvy about how to do politics around the law. So that, yes, you can sue, and sue first in state courts where constitutions are favorable, but you also have to make sure that the legislature is not going to step in later and try to amend the Constitution and take it away, as happened in Hawaii. And the later suits that became successful in Vermont, and especially in Massachusetts and in Iowa, you know, what is impressive about those was not just the lawyering and the win in court, but that activists had done the political work to ensure that politicians were not going to step in and take away a victory afterwards, as happened in some places, as happened in California, where I lived, as happened in Maine. And so I think the activism was less sort of like mass people in the streets activism as really smart, targeted, often legislative focused, but it was essential to, and then moving public opinion. The way that, part of the story of Barack Obama changing his position on this issue was it became harder for him as the head of a Democratic Party seeking re-election to be opposed to same-sex marriage than it was to be in favor of it, and that was some significant, very sophisticated work to change the opinions of the public and Democratic elites so that basically the guy who controlled the Justice Department decided that the politically safe thing for me to do is to send my Solicitor General before the Supreme Court and argue that these state laws are unconstitutional. And that activism drove a lot of that.
How did the politics of same-sex marriage influence the decision-making of the Supreme Court?
So, there's this really interesting moment where so there are a few moments where there are sort of these big strategy sessions where the lawyers and groups, gay rights groups, who are focused on winning marriage equality come up with sort of national strategies. The first one's in 2005. They meet, they set a goal of getting before the Supreme Court in 2025. And even then, that's seen as an optimistic timeline for a winning case before the Supreme Court. They go back and revise this 5 years later. And one of the things that comes out of that period is an idea of, that the building blocks for a successful Supreme Court case are that you need to have, some combination of legalized marriage, domestic partnerships or civil unions, other progress maybe around issues like adoption in enough states that sort of two things happen. One, that it shows that you have enough of a patchwork that the federal judiciary feels like there's a role for federal courts to play in standardizing this, but also a way of showing that a significant part of the country had come around to this through either local courts or through the political process, and that it would not be seen as the federal government imposing this on states. It would be seen more as like taking laggard states and bringing them into line with where the rest of the country was and not. And they looked a lot to the example of Loving v. Virginia for what the kind of math would look like so that the Supreme Court thought that this was would not be overstepping its place in the sort of constitutional system. But they realized that another part of that, which, isn't just the number of states that have gotten there, but was going to be public opinion. And so you see this internal shift where starting in 2011, 2012, Freedom to Marry, which is the sort of single issue group working on this, decides that getting to a majority in public opinion, getting to 50 plus 1% of Americans supporting marriage equality is its own goal, not because there's ever going to be a vote or a plebiscite or anything like that, but because basically Anthony Kennedy reads the Washington Post every morning over his Cheerios or whatever Supreme Court justices have for breakfast, and he's going to look and see polling data, and that, that part of the argument that you want to make to justices outside of what you're putting in your briefs and arguing in oral arguments is let them know that the country will be accepting of this. And so you get a real effort spending money in places like New York, where the laws are, where marriage is already legal, and we're in 2012, 2013, where marriage is legal, and places like Kansas, where it's very clear that marriage is not going to be legal here, short of a federal court getting involved. But that if you can move support for marriage in New York or in Kansas and help move it to 50% nationally, eventually that's going to show up in press coverage that's going to influence the justices. And there's, throughout this story, one of the areas where I think you really see the savvy of the people who did this in a way that I think, is a really useful example for other political social movements is how much they understood the interplay of politics and the law. I mean, one of the things that is remarkable when you look at a lot of political movements is how detached the people who do the political work are from the people who do the legal work on a very similar issue. And at some point here, they worked in a very productive sort of tandem, and it goes in both directions.
Why was the role of the president so important in an issue decided by the Supreme Court, Sasha?
It's a great question. So, 3 straight presidential reelection campaigns are in their way shaped by this issue. In 1996, Bill Clinton, I won't say reluctantly, but sort of apologetically signs the Defense of Marriage Act into law. And it significantly defined then Bill Clinton's relationship with, not just the LGBT community, but I think his liberal base more broadly. I think if you went and, asked a bunch of lefties anywhere who are old enough to have strong memories of the Clinton years, what did you like or dislike about him? Once you get to the dislikes, I think the Defense of Marriage Act, welfare reform, those are going to be the things that they bring up as sort of the perceived betrayals. George W. Bush runs for re-election. He'd been opposed to gay marriage before, but he early in 2004 endorses a constitutional amendment, an amendment to the federal constitution to ban same-sex marriage that ends up passing the Senate but not getting the supermajority necessary. And then Barack Obama in May of 2012 announces that he has changed his position. In the first 2, there was a clear role for the president in the process, right? The Defense of Marriage, Bill Clinton did not want the Defense of Marriage Act to come to him, but he made clear if it came to his desk, he would sign it. There is I guess the president does not have an obvious role in the constitutional amendment process, but as the leader of his party with legislation moving on the Hill, there was an obvious interest in knowing his view on that. In the case of Obama in 2012, it's kind of totally incidental. At the time, there is really nothing. Obama's already decided that his Justice Department is not going to defend the Defense of Marriage Act in court. That was one of the things that helped lead the political folks in the White House to think that it was sort of safe for him to change his position, was that they'd gotten very little blowback when Eric Holder made this announcement that in early 2011 that the court was not going to defend the law, which is that the Justice Department was not going to defend the law, which is a really unusual position for the Attorney General and Solicitor General to take. But it had become, I think, certainly within the Democratic Party, such a, in 2004, 2008, such a big question of where do our candidates stand on this during the primary. And Obama had been in the mainstream of the Democratic Party through that period, which was to take the position, which is the same place where John Kerry and Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden and were, which is to say some version of, I think marriage is between a man and a woman, but I think that gay and lesbian couples are entitled to all the same, rights and responsibilities through something like civil unions. And, what had changed was that was not sustainable within his party anymore. And the thing that really catalyzed the period where the Obama White House had basically already decided that they've been working through this for about 9 months before Biden makes his sort of accidentally blurted out comment on Meet the Press in May of 2012. But the thing that had one question that is worth asking is why was Meet the Press asking the Vice President of the United States on some random Sunday in May of 2012, what's your opinion on this issue that is not before the White House? And it was because activists with Freedom to Marry, had launched a petition drive that February trying to get the Democratic Party to change their platform plank. And you've been around politics long enough to know that, usually these party platforms are totally irrelevant now. But activists had recognized that it was a way to insert this into the news, and they decided that they were going to focus on this as a place to push the Democratic Party. And so they got a bunch of former DNC chairs to say that they supported this. And then all of a sudden, Antonio Villaraigosa, who was going to be the chair or honorary chair or something, presiding officer of something of the convention, said that he supported changing the platform plank. So then Nancy Pelosi, who I forget what all the titles at conventions are, but she's the one with the gavel, she says she supports changes. So now all of a sudden, activists and the media are basically confronting every Democrat on Capitol Hill. Well, do you agree with Nancy Pelosi that the Democratic Party should change its position on this? And that leads to cabinet secretaries being asked when they do interviews about other topics. And that's what pushed this into the news, where Joe Biden is being asked. And that was, sort of pushed onto the agenda by activists who created this as a point of friction within the party by basically inventing a media event over, do you support changing the platform, which has obviously no actual policy ramifications.
Okay. With a recent shift in the Supreme Court, many activists are concerned about the right to same-sex marriage could be at risk. Do you share that concern?
I do not. I think that so 6 years ago, the Supreme Court ruled that struck down state bans, including one in Kansas, for example, on same-sex marriage, and said that the fundamental right to marriage extends to same-sex couples. That was the Obergefell v. Hodges opinion. I do not, one thing that's really remarkable, especially in a week where we're talking a lot about the future of Roe v. Wade, is 50 years after, it's been clear almost for 50 years that there was an effort to undo Roe, right? Almost from the moment that the court ruled on Roe v. Wade in 1973. First, the effort was to amend the U.S. Constitution. There were some, attempts at that throughout the 70s and into the early 80s. Once it became clear that a human life amendment was not going to become law, the pro-life community decided that there would be what has been an incredibly systematic and at the moment looks successful effort to bring this issue, to build some incremental precedents to get back before the Supreme Court, to get the court to revisit the fundamental holding of Roe v. Wade. I have seen no evidence in the last 6 years since the court ruled on marriage that there is an effort or really a constituency to get the court to revisit the core holding of Obergefell, which is that the fundamental right to marriage extends to same-sex couples. Folks on the right have, I think, basically accepted that they lost that fight. What they did do was very quickly sort of pivot to two other issues. One is all the transgender or gender identity related issues, which, were a lot of the sort of political and legal infrastructure that had been built to fight marriage got shifted even before the court ruled in Obergefell, because public opinion was a lot more friendly, and they were basically going from a place where they were losing a fight to a place where they would be on the sort of front foot on a fight. So that was sort of one big shift. The other shift, which I think does bear on the sort of Supreme Court now, is this push towards religious liberty, religious freedom exemptions. And we've seen a number of cases come before the Supreme Court that touch on marriage. One Masterpiece Bake Shop, which was I think 3 years ago came to the Supreme Court, was a Colorado baker who said that he did not want to make or refused to make a custom cake for a same-sex couple that had married in Massachusetts and was celebrating their wedding in Colorado. I said that it violated his biblical beliefs. Another case that the court ruled on this summer, Catholic Social Service Agency in Philadelphia that had a city contract to place foster children with families, and said that it violated Catholic teaching to put them with same-sex parents. In both of these cases, the court has basically evaded the core question, but there's every indication that this court will look very favorably on claims for these types of religious liberty, religious freedom exemptions. And where I can imagine this goes is in a few years, maybe something along the lines of the Hobby Lobby case, in which the company said that it did not want to include contraception as part of its health insurance coverage for employees because that violated the company's religious views. You could see something similar where maybe a company says that our board or shareholders or management, thinks that same-sex marriage contravenes our religious beliefs, so we will not give paternity leave we'll give it to opposite sex, partners, employees who are in opposite sex relationships but not same-sex relationships, or we'll give dental coverage to the straight spouses of our employees but not to the gay or lesbian spouses of our employees. I could imagine that being the sort of area on which, we'd end up in a very ironic position for, where I think religious conservatives might be arguing basically accepting that the state has to marry every couple equally, but religious conservatives would be in the position of arguing it doesn't really mean anything if the state marries you because that's meaningless and private actors should have incredible leeway to determine who they want to treat as married. And so I think that it's a different dynamic. It's fundamentally a concession that they lost the bigger fight to define marriage in the law and now want to be sheltered from having to recognize those, which is I think we could be dealing with the Supreme Court that could be effectively limiting the impact of the Obergefell decision, but not ever sort of revisiting it.
Okay. Sasha, you used our archive and other historical and political collections. What unique perspective on political and legislative development on this issue did you get from doing that research?
Yeah, I mean, so one thing that was really, I think it was 2015. I spent basically a week here, and I was a beneficiary of a research travel grant. Is that what you call it? Research, something like that. Yeah, that allowed me to come in and work in the archives and get particular help from Audrey and the archivist here. Because Senator Dole, just in the final months before he left the Senate, during the '96 campaign, co-sponsored the Defense of Marriage Act. Don Nichols had sort of taken the lead on drafting it, but Dole lent his name to it. So, one of the things that was really interesting to me, winding back to what I was talking about, like, the question for me is, how does this go from something that I've sort of reconstructed a couple of political and legal officials within the Mormon Church in Salt Lake City have identified as a priority for them, to something that's on the desk of the President of the United States in the fall of 1996. A guy who in 1992, he had never been asked, he'd never spoken a word about gay marriage, and all of a sudden, the congressional leadership has this as a priority. And so, some part of that was I wanted to understand, how does this issue move from a concern of activists to politicians? And that's almost like a forensic reconstruction of the ideas. And so I spent time. Bob Barr was took the lead on this in the House. He was a Republican from Georgia who later left the Republican Party to run for president as a libertarian. Don Nichols. So Barr's papers were at the University of West Georgia, and I think I was the first person to look at those after they opened up. Senator Nichols' papers are in Stillwater, Oklahoma, at OSU. I got his office they're closed. He's still a lobbyist and active enough that there's some sensitivity, but I got his office to agree to open those up. I think I was the first person at least to look at the DOMA stuff. And the Dole papers and some other members. And, what I wanted to sort of see was how this migrates, and what you do see the interplay of, in this case, Senator Dole being a candidate for president. He gets invited to speak at what's called the campaign of the National Campaign to Protect Marriage, I think, is a group that basically pops up out of nowhere in late 1995 and decides that they're going to try to make this a national issue, and I think very intelligently says, we're going to do that by going to Iowa and planting a flag there before the caucuses. And now I see a lot of activist groups do this. I think this was still sort of early enough in the understanding the centrality of Iowa, that this struck me as novel, and so I believe it's the Saturday night before the caucuses at a mega church in West Des Moines. They have this big rally, 2,000 people in attendance, and they have a pledge that basically they ask the Republican candidates to pledge that they will use every power to stop gay marriage and limit these Hawaii marriages from being recognized. Dole's not in attendance. A bunch of candidates are in attendance, and they sign in person. Dole sends a letter saying he'll do whatever he can. And so in that case, it's, what I was able to do here and with the Nichols papers was sort of see the interplay of the electoral dynamics in that case and the actual legislative lawyering that led to drafting half of DOMA. And DOMA was sort of jerry-rigged together between something that came up in the House, something that came up in the Senate, and they put these two parts of it together basically at the last minute so that they could put out a single piece of legislation. And politicians don't have any interest in, sometimes they tell a story about how they got interested in an issue, but there's a reason that people use the sausage-making metaphor for legislation, which is that usually they don't want to be particularly transparent about the internal negotiations that got them there. But what happened was the Supreme Court ends up striking down the Defense of Marriage Act in 2013. And so it wasn't just an issue of, at that point, for me, that it was a kind of curious, the byways of the legislative process. The question of how this thing ended up becoming law got drafted the way it did was really important as a constitutional question too.
Okay. I can hear myself. Could everybody hear Sasha okay on that?
Oh.
Now we lost a mic, but we need to get that fixed. Okay.
Sorry.
No, I was afraid that had happened. So, and I want to say, since we're waiting on a handheld mic, you mentioned our associate director Audrey Coleman, who runs our archive and all of our museum and everything. She gave me the last two questions because we wanted to ask about specifically how you utilize archives. So now I'm going to let you respond to that again if that's okay.
Sure, yeah. Thank you. So, I use a whole bunch of legislators' archives, and one of the things that politicians aren't usually transparent about the origins of and the sort of deal making that goes into drafting a bill. And in this case, it was really unusual because this issue had come out of nowhere. So the question of if you are a politician who's being asked, in this case in January 1996, as these presidential candidates were, will you do something about same-sex marriage? It was not self-evident what the answer for a congressman or a senator or a governor would be in another state. And so for me, I wanted to reconstruct how did this bill get written the way it did, who were the entities that were shaping the way it was written. Ends up being that the Family Research Council, which, that the Family Research Council, which basically is Dr. James Dobson's focus on the family's political unit in D.C., played a very large role in shaping how Don Nichols' team through the what's called the Senate Republican Study Committee. Republican Policy Committee. It's different in the House and Senate, which is sort of a group of particularly conservative lawmakers who had a kind of think tank on the Hill, ended up drafting this. And I had to reconstruct that through, the things about archives are you're getting people's notes from meetings, you're getting faxes. It was a delightful period in American history where people printed out their emails. That is, if you ask me what the heyday of America was, it was when people printed out their emails. And so you get a real ability to reconstruct, often minute to minute, hour to hour, the efforts to put together this, to reconcile what folks in the House are doing, what folks in the Senate were doing, and that's all happening obviously in the context of a presidential election in which Dole is becoming the nominee of his party, and so
what I learned was I had not sort of been cognizant of this when I started the project, but it became clear to me as I spent time in archives like this that I'd sort of stumbled into a sweet spot of historical writing, which is it was far enough into the past that there were archival collections that were available to me, not just from legislators, but the Human Rights Campaign, the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force have given their papers from the 90s and 2000s to university libraries. The lawyer who filed that Hawaii case gave all of his papers once the case was done. He became a judge. He gave them to the UC Berkeley Library. And so it was just far enough in the past that these sort of legislative or legal fights were closed and people had given their papers, but it was recent enough that almost everybody involved was still alive. Still, some people didn't want to talk to me, but almost all of them were able to talk to me. And I was able to often play, I joked, I'm a non-lawyer who spent a lot of time around lawyers while working on this book, and I joked that I got to play deposition because I would go find these documents in archives, then I'd show up with my, iPad where I'd loaded everything onto them, and I'd sit down for an interview, and I'd be able to say like, oh, so, it seems on March 27, 1996, you wrote in a memo that you think X and Y, and I'd hand over the iPad, and they'd look at it, and they'd say, like, where did you find this? And I'd say, I found it at the University of wherever. And they say, oh, my God, I haven't thought about this. Okay. And then they'd go through it, and they'd basically, took them some time to, like, reconfigure. They could try to get back to what they thought then, but they would walk me through. Okay, well, I sent it to Jeff. He was the guy in my office who did this. I must have been thinking this. I mentioned that. Oh, right. That was because we were worried. And so I was able often in the, and I hope this comes through in the storytelling, that, you have the benefit of the paper trail, but I'm able to also really explain to you what the thinking and motivations and goals of the people who were doing this were, because I often was able to interview them. And, the other thing you realize with archives is, frankly, just how poor people's memories are. And I don't, not as an accusation, people who are incredibly sharp, who you think have a command of detail, lawyers, who are off times by decades in their memories of when things happened. And, as journalists, we go in and think that I think default to thinking that the gold standard of reporting is to get a live subject to tell you uniquely on the record something that happened. And what I realized is that often if you don't have other documents to corroborate that, even people who are not trying to mislead you often do, just because quite reasonably asking them about things that happened 20, 30 years ago is a fraud exercise.
Okay, Sasha, I have one final question, then we're going to open it up to audience Q&A. And I know that we've got quite a few people who are likely watching on YouTube tonight. So if you're watching on YouTube and you have a question, we are accepting them. Send them to dolequestions@ku.edu. That's dolequestions@ku.edu, and we'll get to as many of those as we can. But my final question is, Sasha, what advice would you give to someone looking to political collections to write for a popular audience?
I think that one big part of the early part of my narrative is largely how something becomes an issue, and also sort of how an issue moves from the kind of margins to the center of our politics. And that's partially what I think you asked about, Bill, earlier, which is like how a local issue becomes a national issue, but also how, Hawaii like literally is the margins of our politics, but how things migrate and become really central. And it is often something I think that we as political reporters don't do a good job of telling, we're filled with all sorts of issues that, like, critical race theory was not a political issue, I don't know, a year ago. And I don't think that there's, often even, people who are regular readers of good newspapers and magazines, I think are often sort of poorly served by coverage. It's like, okay, everybody's fighting about this thing, and there's not enough explanation of like, well, how did this become a thing that we fight over? And you know, politics is in part, you know, a question of what are the things we fight over, and then how do coalitions and institutions organize themselves around those issues. And like the question you were asking in the beginning was like, how did the Republican Party become opposed to this? You know, I mean, I think there are a few parts of this. One is, yes, there's this sort of individual liberty potential contradiction. There's a sort of federalist states' rights contradiction. The other thing is, like, I could imagine a kind of counterfactual world where in the 1980s, you know, the gay liberation movement is sort of pushing for increased freedom and liberty to define private sexual relations any way they can. And imagine alternate universe 2 where, like, you know, Fred Phelps or Pat Robertson or whoever is arguing that we should have, like, you know, compulsory marriage for homosexuals so they'll stop being so promiscuous. Like, it is not, to me, self-evident that this issue developed the way it did, that the coalitions arrayed themselves the way they did, that it fell on the ideological lines the way they did. And I think too often we probably are forced by kind of poor media coverage taking for granted that certain people are on certain sides of certain issues. And sometimes that's a story about money and lobbying. Sometimes it's a story about coalitions and interest groups. Sometimes it's a story about, like, kind of freakish luck, you know, that certain issues land when they do and people in power respond the way they do. And so I guess, you know, a lot of it is on picking the subject, but I do think that there are probably a lot of topics that explain how something becomes an issue could be really, really enlightening, and not just because it tells you something about that particular issue, but I think something about how our politics works, and it can be instructive as you look at future issues.
Okay. Well, we're going to open it up to your questions now. Catherine and Raina have microphones, so if you'll raise your hand, one of them will bring a microphone to you. Please ask just one question, no filibustering. And I want to say once more for our audience watching on YouTube, if you have a question tonight, email your question as quickly as possible to dolequestions@ku.edu, and we will try to get to as many of those as we can. Okay, thank you.
Yes, Doctor. Let me just preface that
I'm not a doctor, if you're talking to me, yeah.
I spent 24 years in the Vermont legislature, and I voted. I was in the House, and I voted for civil union, and I was there when we voted to legalize gay marriage and full equality. My question is, Vermont's a small state. I'm just curious to see, and I noticed you have a section in your book. I looked at the table of contents, from the mountains or something. I think it was that. Could you just share with us what a small state like Vermont, which was the first state to legislatively approve and grant full equality, what that movement, what that small state, how did that spread throughout? I know it spread throughout New England, but nationally.
Yeah. So what's your name, sir?
Paul Poirier.
Great to meet you, Paul. So take you back. So Hawaii, what happens, right, is they win at the Hawaii Supreme Court in 1993. The legislature steps in 1996, and in 1997 basically sends this to the legislature, puts this on the ballot in the fall of 1998 to amend the Hawaii Constitution to take this out of the court's hands. So couples never marry in Hawaii. And the lesson to gay rights activists who are interested in marriage is, like, we need to do the political. If we're going to sue, we need to find. We're going to do it in state court, definitely, because federal courts are really unfriendly to basic gay rights claims. So if we're going to file in another state, yes, we need a friendly judiciary, a state constitution that has provisions that are uniquely useful. Vermont happens to have something called the Common Benefits Clause. There's no reason, if you haven't studied Vermont constitutional law, you should know what this is. It dates back to the Republic of Vermont in 17, yes. But it allowed litigators to make the claim that this violated the Vermont Constitution because gay couples were being denied this equal benefits under as that straight couples could have. But then the other part of it was that that there had to be political work that was done. And so there's a case that's filed in in May of 1997. It's called Baker v. State, that is challenging the exclusion of gay couples under Vermont's marriage law, under this clause in the state constitution. But already for basically 2 years before then, activists have been quietly meeting with Governor Howard Dean as the governor at the time. Vermont happens to have an appointed attorney general, as does Hawaii. So they're slightly insulated from the political pressures, perhaps, of elected attorneys general, and recognize that even if we win at the courts, we're going to. And Vermont also, it's very difficult to amend the Constitution there. And so these are part of the reasons why they talk about the second front. Where are we going to go after we've lost the political battle in Hawaii, and Vermont is seen as a very favorable venue for that. And then, what happens very quickly in December '99 is that it's kind of a split decision before the Vermont Supreme Court. The court rules that, yes, it violates this equal benefits clause, common benefits clause, to deny same-sex couples the same benefits under law, but tells the legislature, you don't actually have to let the couples marry, you just have to find some other solution under which they get the benefits, and that's where the term civil unions comes from. And so it ends up being kind of like a compromise position, but it's basically also the least that the court is willing to accept at that point. And that ends up informing a lawsuit that's filed the following year in Massachusetts. Mary Bonato, who was a lawyer who had been co-counsel in Vermont, files the Massachusetts case, ends up arguing Obergefell before the Supreme Court 15 years later. What they learned from the Vermont case is we need to, both in our public messaging and before the courts, be arguing about the unique institution of marriage and not just the discrete rights and benefits. Because if we just say it's about these discrete legal rights and benefits, a court can come back and say, okay, you can get civil unions and you've satisfied the concern here. We need to argue that there's something symbolically, emotionally, uniquely resonant about marriage that only letting gays and lesbians marry will satisfy.
Okay, we got a question right here.
Hello, yes, thank you for coming tonight. My question is, I was struck by something you said there at the end of Bill's questions about like how it wasn't always clear that this was going to be the fight line. And I've always thought there was like this irony of, this progressive movement, like the heart of it is this small c conservative institution is like being like what they're struggling for, and that not, necessarily being something that even a lot of progressive LGBTQ activists were in favor of. I wonder if there's like something about like that like shifted the Overton window, or if there's something about that like contradiction that is that seemingly at the heart of that, about like this conservative institution being argued for by progressives.
Yeah, so I'll give you another small c conservative institution, the military. I mean, it is remarkable, I think, that the two areas, certainly from the 90s to the 2010s, where both the LGBT movement probably invested the most capital and had the greatest success, were winning acceptance into these two arguably the two most conservative institutions in American life. And I'll note that by the 1990s, both of them institutions that basically straight people didn't want to be part of anymore. We're not clamoring for acceptance in. Let's say that, in case my wife's watching this live stream. So yes, I think surprising from the vantage of the 90s, potentially ironic. The shorthand of how that happened, there was nothing approaching consensus within the gay and lesbian community. Just for the sake of shorthand, there are a lot of bisexual and transgender people who were always able to marry the person they loved regardless of state laws. So really this was an issue uniquely for gay men and lesbians. There was nothing approaching consensus that marriage was worth fighting for. And so the divides in the 80s, there were a few. Some was strategic, which was, this is ridiculous. We're never going to win marriage rights. It's so distant. We have these incremental gains that are more materially meaningful for people, winning basic non-discrimination protections, maybe getting companies to recognize domestic partnerships. Why are we picking a big fight we aren't going to win when we could do more gradualist things? There's that. But then there's a real ideological split. And some of it is, a sort of tension between basically liberationists and assimilationists within the gay and lesbian community. On one side, people arguing basically the success of this relatively new movement and community is that we do not feel bound by the definitions and expectations of what constitutes a family or a relationship. We've spent now, by 1990, 20 years post-Stonewall trying to break free of this and winning, and full citizenship for us will be having the ability to have our relationships exist in whatever structure or organization we want, and why would we, I'm paraphrasing somebody's critique here, but why would we, having won, this success of self-definition, fight for inclusion into the white picket fence, suburban, conservative lives of our parents that we are explicitly trying to break free from? And then there's a related but separate critique of marriage that's coming mostly from women who, basically LGBT family law in the 1980s is overwhelmingly the province of women. Female lawyers representing female clients who were generally women who'd been in heterosexual marriages, gotten pregnant, had a child, and then come out, leave their marriage, and then have to go to court to fight for the rights of their own biological child, and the lawyers who represent them. And these are, women who had gone to college or law school in the 60s, 70s, been shaped by thinking of sort of second wave feminism to see marriage as this sort of fundamentally patriarchal institution that existed, solely to disadvantage women. And they saw this, frankly, more as feminists than as lesbians, I think. Why would we as women make our demand inclusion into this institution that exists to disadvantage us? And so they argued that the goal of LGBT family law should be what people sometimes call multiple families, a regime where instead of having marriage be the only institution that the state recognizes that allows you to transfer property to somebody else or share custody of a child or a whole bunch of things, that gays and lesbians should be fighting for a regime in which a broad spectrum of relationships, single parents, multi-parent households, co-parent adoptions by people who don't have any relationship with one another, communal living, should all win equal status under the law. And so this was a really active but very abstract debate through the 1980s because there wasn't a court case about marriage. And then what happens basically is, unlikely win in Hawaii, the Mormons get a hold of this issue, start organizing, an anti-gay right that in the 1980s had been trying to stop gays and lesbians from winning all sorts of forms of citizenship, but they weren't trying to stop gays and lesbians from marrying because there weren't any gays or lesbians who were trying to marry in the 1980s. And so they're trying to stop them from becoming school teachers and stop governments from treating AIDS as a disability and, a million other things. But by the mid-90s, basically religious conservatives decide that the place we want to fight the ascendant gay rights movement is on this issue of marriage. And almost instantly, the internal divisions within the gay rights movement go away. I quote Paula Edelbrick, who had been, arguably the leading sort of feminist critic, a lawyer who'd been with Lambda Legal, leading sort of feminist critic of marriage within the movement. And she says, our opponents, the world is blowing up over our relationships. Our opponents are fighting to stop us from having this. Of course, I'm going to be on the other side of that fight. And it ends up being a strategic error probably in taking this local issue from Hawaii and making it a big national issue, in that it, one of the basic laws of politics, I don't know, like Machiavelli or whoever's like, don't unify your opposition. This does it.
Okay. Do we have any questions from our online audience?
How would you describe your experiences covering 4 presidential elections for 4 different news outlets?
Yeah, so thank you. So I started in 2008. I mean, it's hard for me to disentangle a few different things. One, I was at a different stage in my career, and so the things that interested me changed. One, the media environment has changed a whole lot between 2008 and 2020, like, to take the most obvious example, like I covered my first presidential campaign and I knew one reporter was on Twitter and he just wrote where he was going for lunch in Iowa. So there's that. And then like our politics has gone bonkers in that time. And I don't know how much of the sort of changes in covering campaigns can be, from my perspective, can be traced to each of those. But, I think it's gotten harder in certain ways to do interesting campaign reporting because I think it's gotten harder to do. Let me actually put it this way: it's gotten harder to do sort of average campaign reporting because everybody could see everything in real time from wherever they live, and there were a lot of political reporters who it's like, I fly to Des Moines, I go see a speech, I write up the speech, it shows up in my, I write for the Chicago Tribune, I write for the Boston Globe, I write for the LA Times, it shows up in my paper. It was the only way that the people in my community were going to find out what Jack Kemp said yesterday, and like, I quote a few people that they're not hearing from, a few professors or former strategists about what Jack Kemp's speech meant, and then we move on to the next day, and like you've done your part for the newspaper. Well, in this day and age, that speech is being live streamed. Anybody who cares is watching it. It's being, packaged and dissected by cable news effectively in real time. Every other reporter who's there is basically writing live coverage of it on social media. The 2 or 3 professors or former strategists you would have quoted for perspective have already been on like MSNBC 9 times since the speech. They have their own Twitter feeds that people are reading. Like, it's just really hard to pretend that the kind of like very dutiful campaign coverage of yesteryear like adds anything now. I think that there's still an opening for good enterprising political reporting, and that's sort of what I've become increasingly inclined to do. And a lot of my stuff is focused on what I wrote in the Victory Lab, which is really getting into how campaigns work. The crazy thing is that a lot of what I thought I understood about how campaigns work, or what makes for a good campaign, were sort of turned on their heads in 2016 at least. And so I don't know if my self-doubt is because I didn't do a good job covering 2016 or Donald Trump broke what we thought worked in American politics, or we can leave that part of the conversation for another day.
All right, we have another question. Do you know of any research suggesting that same-sex marriage is more successful or less successful than traditional marriage between a man and a woman?
So there's been a whole bunch of research, the more or less successful, like what constitutes more or less successful. If you got 10 social scientists, you get 25 opinions on that probably. What there has been, there have been a number of trials in courts in which states have to justify why they treat same-sex couples differently than opposite-sex couples. So there was a trial in Hawaii in 1996. There was a trial in federal court in California in 2010 over Proposition 8. There was another one over Michigan's law a couple years later. And at each point, the Attorney General has gone out and tried to find experts to come in and say, we have a good reason for treating these relationships differently. It's better for the community or better for children, for only opposite-sex couples to raise children. And every time, a judge has laughed the state out of court based on the quality of evidence and expert witnesses they've put forward. And so, I'm in no position to referee the research, but the judges who've been shown this in an adversarial process have basically said you have done nothing to demonstrate to this court that there are meaningful differences in outcomes, and that has to do with how children come out of different types of households, for example, their psychological composition, their earning power, their educational performance. Once gay and lesbian couples started being able to legally marry in the U.S. and Massachusetts in May of 2004, there was a lot of study of what happened to those couples, because for the first time, and they were not getting divorced at any higher rate. They were, there was no obvious evidence that these marriages were any less successful. And I think that 15 years later, we're, I think that to summarize a big body of work, we're in the same place, which is, by some measures, there's maybe evidence that gays and lesbians have had more successful marriages, but there could also be a bit of a selection bias problem in that the couples who were intent on being part of the first wave to get married in various circumstances might have been people who were maybe more invested or more focused, or had waited longer in their pre-marriage. If you've been waiting for the Supreme Court to rule, it's maybe less of a shotgun marriage type thing.
Okay, we have time for a couple more questions, so go ahead, sir.
Hi, yeah, so you mentioned that the conservative response to the Obergefell v. Hodges decision was not necessarily to overturn the decision, but more to emphasize, individual or company rights to deny same-sex couples specific rights or privileges. So what has been like the LGBTQ movement's response to that, both legally and as a community? Yeah.
Yeah, great. Charlie, is that right? You, Charlie? Yeah. Thank you. Good question. So, I think the big turn, right, on the right, just to start with, was basically the end of what had been a generation-long project to change laws to reflect biblical teaching. I mean, it's not an accident that Jerry Falwell calls his group the moral majority. The underlying argument of basically all evangelical and to some degree fundamentalist involvement in politics since the 1980s has been premised under the assumption that America is a majority Judeo-Christian country, and thus the laws should reflect biblical values. Basically, they conceded defeat on that fundamental premise even before Obergefell was decided. And now if you go and we're here, we're not watching Fox News. If we turn on Fox News for 10 minutes tonight, at any point, you would not hear a single person say, we are the majority, the law should reflect our values. It's, we are a minority, and it is big tech, academia, the courts, Hollywood, woke capital, whatever that means, that have us as Christian, Christian conservatives under siege, and we need to be protected from a tyrannical majority with too much power. That's now the posture of conservatives. So the question is, what do LGBT groups do? So they are basically arguing for very limited religious liberty, religious freedom exemptions in these cases. It has been understood that churches and clerical organizations have big leeway on stuff that is core to their ministerial functions. You don't have to, if you have an archdiocese, you don't have to hire a Jew to be a priest, right? Like the courts recognize that, but you can't necessarily discriminate when you're hiring a janitor based on their religion. And so the question is, what that starts to look like as state and federal courts or legislatures decide that there are more areas where you can't discriminate against people. And so that's a big negotiation, and figuring out where the balance is between recognition of basic religious liberty, religious freedom, exemptions up against the rights of individuals or organizations to be free from discrimination is, I think, we're at the beginning of a long ongoing negotiation there. And and there are different folks within the LGBT rights movement who people have come up with sort of different views on how much you need to accept or concede the existence of these religious liberty, religious freedom exemptions, or to what extent you think the opposition is being basically sincere or disingenuous. Is this just basically a rearguard action from people who lost the big fight over gay marriage to carve out as many smaller wins as they can to be shielded from this? Or is this a good faith effort in a country that has long respected, has had constitutional protections for religious practice to treat these differently? And I think, so that's a big open question. You know, the other place that they moved on the trans issues is the other thing that's a big challenge for, I think, you know, as a coalition for the LGBT movement, is that, you know, this varies a lot in different parts of the country, and obviously you're in a state that does not have any non-discrimination, equal protection coverage for any part of the LGBT coalition. But there are, I think, in certain parts of the country, a lot of places where, you know, folks feel that the basic civil rights work for gay men and lesbians and bisexuals has been done, but that other things need to be fought. And I think there's a real question about how organizations, institutions that were built to represent a coalition as it was defined in the 1980s or 1990s, you know, either survive or reimagine themselves given how the coalition has changed and the issues that they have to deal with now sit on other parts of that coalition.
Okay, we have time for one last question.
The last one would be, you've done lots of research.
Yeah.
Are there areas that you think have not been covered that you need to cover, or at least someone else needs to cover about this same topic?
Yeah, great question. I love assigning work to other imaginary people. So, you know, one thing that was really important to me when I started this book was writing about both supporters and opponents of same-sex marriage, and people who changed their position on this. You know, I think one of the things, to the extent that things had been written about gay marriage, they were often written by folks who either had been, you know, either legal academics, participants in this, as plaintiffs or lawyers, lobbyists, but almost always from people who were either active in the LGBT movement or very closely identified with its goals and had a, you know, were sort of clear supporters of one side and wrote their books from the vantage of their side of the movement. And some of these were very useful accounts of court cases or state-level political fights, but they were often really poor, I think, accounts of what are fundamentally adversarial processes: litigation, a legislative fight, a ballot measure fight. You know, you have two sides that are adversarial, and often these books would write, you know, there's a very good book that a guy named Mark Solomon, who is you know, maybe the top legislative lobbyist for freedom to marry and had done state level work in Massachusetts, wrote about the work he did in Massachusetts, New York, California. It's one of the best accounts I've read of lobbying state legislators. But he like doesn't write about the opponents, which is fine. Like, that's the perspective he brings to it, but it leaves you a little cold in trying to understand what you're fighting against and so one of the things I really wanted to do was write about the other side. You know, and so there's a lot of my book that's about the Mormon Church, for example, and I found ways to get the material I needed for that, but it was harder to get people to talk. And I've never covered sports, but I presume that, you know, if you have a choice of, you know, it's probably really interesting in the losers' locker room, but and if you could get somebody in there to talk and open up, they probably have a lot to say, but my guess is you probably get a lot more people who are like, no, not tonight. I'm gonna go take my shower and stew in private, and you go to the winners' locker room, and probably people, I don't know how reflective they'll be, but they're probably really happy to talk to you. And it felt a lot like that when I started going to people for interviews for this book. There's one guy in particular, this guy Matt Daniels, who shows up in my narrative around 1999. He starts a group called the Alliance for Marriage, which is like the first single-issue anti-gay marriage group on the right. Young, you know, sort of handsome, well-put-together guy in his 30s. You know, his real insight was that the anti-gay marriage activism beforehand had been limited by the fact that both in reality and in public image, it was seen as very much a vehicle for evangelical Christians who were driven solely by biblical values, and that was limiting in their ability to build broad coalitions. And so he came out and he said, my group is going to be ecumenical. You look at his first press conferences, and there are, you know, folks from the Black Church, there are Orthodox Jews, there are Jehovah's Witnesses. It is not just white men. gets a lot of press coverage for this. Profiled in The Atlantic, profiled on the front page of USA Today, interviewed on national TV. He ends up putting together the first draft of the federal marriage amendment, and it's like a significant national figure, and quite reasonably, he sort of has this idea of how to put a kinder, gentler, to coin a phrase, face on this movement. So I went to try to find this guy so I could interview him for my book. His name's Matthew Daniels. It's a little hard to Google. And like, I can't find him. Like, he just stopped showing up in Nexus searches. He stopped showing up in the news like around 2006-07. And eventually I find a biography, a bio page for some like international development think tank in DC. There's a guy, Matthew Daniels, and he looks kind of like an older version of the guy I saw in the news clips, and like same college, and like the years match up, and then I find his LinkedIn, and they don't anywhere mention that he started his career as head of this organization that gave him a national profile. He's just purged it entirely from his, public history, and has moved on to another issue and policy issue that has nothing to do with marriage or family, and didn't respond to any of my efforts to reach him. Clearly just, wants to pretend this never happened. And there are, that was surprising given how, much he ran for attention when he was involved in this. Not a shy guy, or wasn't then. But Barbara, to answer your question, I still think that there are a number of folks on the the right of this issue, on ultimately the losing side of this at various points who, I think I did as good a job as I could under the circumstances, sort of reconstructing what they were up to, but it was harder to get them to talk. And I think that I would hope before they leave us that somewhere somebody is getting them to put on the record sort of what they were doing on the other side of this debate, because it's an important part of the history too.
I want to ask everyone to join me in thanking Sasha for coming to the Dole Institute tonight. Very educational. Sasha's book is called The Engagement. We're selling it out front, and Sasha is going to sign some copies. I want to thank all of you for being bold enough under the circumstances to come out to an in-person program. We appreciate that very much. I also want to thank you for your patience. You can tell we've been away from this a year and a half, and we're just a tad rusty on some of our performance issues at the Dole Institute, but we'll get a lot better. So hope to see you next Thursday night at Constitution Day that Barbara mentioned. It will be at 7 p.m. in this hall. And again, great book, fascinating. Pick up copies for people for Christmas, for Thanksgiving, for any kind of thing you need. Yeah, anything, Constitution Day. So thank you all for coming out tonight.